so turn with me to Revelation 20. That's where we'll start at. We're going to be all over the place. I've been teaching for a year so far with Michael, and I usually don't touch Revelation. That's a fun one, but we're going to be there partially today as we talk about God's wrath. So here in the South, if there is anything common that we see, it's people that have been burned at a church. If you talk to 10 people at the Walmart, one of them will admit that they have been hurt at a church at some point in their lives. Somebody said something to them, or the politics of the church were elevated higher than the Bible, or the people were backbiting and toxic. But the fact is that if we were 100% honest, then every individual that has been a member of a church would say, I've been hurt at some point. But what we know is that, like mature adults, we address it and we work through it. Everyone gets hurt. I honestly, Faith tells me I don't have a filter. I just kind of say what's on my mind, and apparently that can be hurtful. I didn't know. So there have been many times where my wife has come to me and said, hey, you need to go apologize to so-and-so. Well, why? Because you said so-and-so. Well, I mean, I didn't lie to them. Well, you need to go tell them. So we've been there. So everyone has been hurt at a church. Well, I'll tell you this, that from the founding of the church in the book of Acts, missions have been a core principle. The apostles and the early church fathers after them, they managed to reach the entire known world with the gospel. From Africa to Russia to England, they covered their bases. After the founding of the New World, the Americas, missionaries flooded over here to give the gospel to native peoples. With the Great Awakenings of the 17 and 1800s, there came after that a renewed focus on missions. America had been established and developed as a country, as with other countries south of us, and they began to send the gospel back overseas. So it came here, converted, they sent it back. Fast forward to modern day, and honestly, missions are not talked about or supported like they were 50 to 70 years ago. We've adopted this policy of it's kind of a invite sinners to church and they'll hear the gospel. Just tell them to come to church. That's evangelism. Tell them to come to church. This isn't just North Georgia. This is everywhere. I've talked to people from Texas who they have the same ideology, and there's more churches in Texas than there are here. So I'm not saying that that's a bad policy, but I'm saying it can't be our only policy. Because from this ideology came the idea of seeker sensitism. So the idea of that is adapt the methodology of the church and the structure of its service to serve and be attractive to a secular community. It's almost like a form of trickery. Like an example of that would be on Super Bowl Sunday. If we air the Super Bowl in the sanctuary where we have a lot of room, a lot of unbelievers will be coming to church. So seeker sensitivity, it may have made some converts, but it's going to be despite the methodology, not a causation from the methodology. So, I promise, it sounds like I'm bouncing around, but one of the harms that comes from the seeker-sensitive movement has been an absolute obsession with the attribute of God's love. So take this. People have been burned at a church. I can't tell you, I believe I've told you before, whenever I worked at Amazon, they should have paid me to be their chaplain. Because what I would do on that night shift is all these young 18 to 30-year-olds that were there. I was the manager there, or the assistant manager running the shift, and they would ask me all kinds of questions, and 9 times out of 10, they were not work-related. It would be, hey, Justin, I know what you've said you believed. I'm having a tough time. What does the Bible say about blank? And I'll tell you, almost every one of those kids, especially the ones from Cleveland for some reason, would always say, I've been burned out on a church. I used to go to blank, but I got hurt, and now, it's just not for me. And I would tell them all the same exact thing. I would say, do you believe in God? Well, yeah, I believe in God. Do you believe that God judges at the end of days? Yeah, God's going to judge everybody. I believe that. Well, then, is it worth you to stand before Him and be judged? And is the excuse going to hold up of, I got hurt, so I left? I don't feel like it's going to hold up. Are you so hurt from this that you're willing to give up your soul? And they still ask me questions after that. Like, they would still, blows my mind. But one of the harms of the seeker-sensitive movement is a pure focus on one attribute, and that is the attribute of love. And it's to the detriment of God's other attributes. And that's because people like to hear that God is love, but they attribute to Him what they think love means. So when an unbeliever hears that God is love, they ascribe it as like this passive love that allows them unbelievable freedom to do what they wish to do, while God kind of sits back and just smiles at them. That's not love. They believe that they're free to sin and even to ignore God, because how could someone that loves them as much as they love themselves be mad at them? They are not aligning to God's conscience, but they're attempting to align God to theirs. And the problem is that they may serve a God, but that God isn't real. They've made Him up. The God that they talk about is not actual God. So when always focusing on God's love, you leave off His other attributes. And the fact is that just like us, God is not one-dimensional and shallow. God has more than one attribute. God is love. Yes, God's also long-suffering, vengeful, wrathful, eternal, holy. I could keep going. There's a bajillion of these that God is. And that is because God is not defined by one thing. Just like you are not defined by one role in your life. So the issue of focusing only on God's love, especially if you're focusing on a wrong definition of it, it leads us to diminish the importance of God's wrath. God told us to fear Him. Reverential fear, like a child to a parent. Usually people stop there. I'm going to go a step further. Holy fear, separate fear, like a creator to a creation. Because remember, God is our Father, but He's also our God. God is a wrathful God. Vengeance belongs to Him. Fortunately, He's also much more long-suffering than the false pagan gods. Last week, we talked about the Egyptian tiger god that was going to destroy everybody, but then got too drunk to be able to function. That's not God. God doesn't get inebriated, and thus His wrath can't come to pass. God is long-suffering with His creation. When we think of God being wrathful, we tend to immediately think of fire and brimstone raining down from heaven. Destroy that Sodom. And honestly though, that's the pagan way of thinking about deity. The gods are mad, so Poseidon has sent a storm. The gods are mad, so the sun beats down and destroys our crops. God's a bit different from this. His wrath can be destructive. We'll talk about that. But it can also be very long-suffering, very patient. So smarter theologians than me have classified God's wrath into 5 categories. And what I want to do is breeze through each of these really, really quickly and not go super deep into anything, but just know the 5 different types of God's wrath. First of all, eternal wrath. Eternal wrath. That speaks of a wrath that is hell, and it ultimately culminates in the lake of fire. You've got it right there in Revelation 20:13. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them, and they were judged, every one according to their deeds. It speaks of the dead being given up at this great white throne judgment. God sits upon the throne, and he judges in great power. And so mighty is he that even the earth and space, the heaven there, flees from him in verse 11. So then he judges the remaining dead, which begs me to ask the question, well, who in the world are the remaining dead at this point in history? So let's put the pieces together. At this point in Revelation, the church has already been caught away, met Jesus in the air, and now dwells in heaven with the Father. By the time you hit chapter 20, the tribulation is ended. Jesus has returned in victory, and he set up his millennial kingdom with his saints. Then it says in here that in verse number 4, that those that died during the tribulation, they come back to life to rule and reign with Christ for 1,000 years. After that, Satan is released, and he gathers an army and lays siege to the holy city where Christ and the saints are. What happens to them? Fire comes down from heaven and destroys them. Then the earth fades away, the heavens fade away, and God judges from the great white throne. Then we see death and hell. That's Hades that I just read. I'm in the NASB. The sea, it all gives up the unrighteous dead. They're judged and they're cast into the lake of fire. And verses 14 and 15 call this the second death. So the fact is that even death and hell are cast into eternal judgment. The unrighteous are judged according to their deeds. So the righteous rely on Jesus being judged for us. That's why we're caught away and we get to rule in a millennial kingdom. The unrighteous have to answer for all their deeds. I can't imagine what that is going to sound like. I wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't want to be there. I would not want to have to answer for every failure that I've ever had, because my goodness, the longer I live, the more I rack them up. And I can't imagine what it's going to sound like when God is judging these unrighteous dead. I imagine there's probably going to be a lot of accusation. Well, God, I wasn't as bad as Hitler. Compared to Stalin, I was great. I'm not Alexander the Conqueror. I imagine there's probably going to be a lot of excuse making. Well, the reason that I did that is that, I didn't have time for you because I was too busy focusing on my family, on my kids. I was too busy doing these other things. You know how much I volunteered. I imagine there's probably going to be a lot of hostility towards God. I imagine a great atheist potentially yelling at God, trying to fight with him, like Christopher Hitchens. How dare you speak to me that way? Who do you think you are? I don't know. At that point, standing right in front of God, he may be face down begging. Who knows? But in chapter 21, verse number 4, it says, God wipes away all tears. I imagine that at this judgment, there will definitely be tears. I imagine if we're nearby, the saints will probably even be accused. So-and-so never told me about this. Why didn't he tell me? So I imagine we'll probably need our tears wiped. When faced against their deeds, the unbelieving dead are found wanting. Remember the scales that we've talked about in the last few months. And they've earned the punishment of eternal hell, the lake of fire. God is so righteous, he cannot be in communion with sin. Thus, sinners must be righteous in his presence. So sinners either are clothed with the righteousness of Christ, or they're suffering the punishment in his eternal wrath. Second, eschatological wrath. If I was mean, I'd ask one of y'all to spell that for me. So eschatology is the study of end times. This wrath is the wrath that takes place during the culmination and the ending of history. A common term used in the Old Testament and the New Testament is the day of the Lord. And the day of the Lord has a lot of aspects in the Old Testament. We'll probably get into that in a lesson way down the road, but I feel like it's best described in Malachi 4:1. For behold, the day is coming, burning like a furnace, and all the arrogant and every evildoer will be chaff. And the day is coming, will set them ablaze, says the Lord of hosts, so that it will leave them neither root or branch. It's a day of judgment. It's a day of vengeance. God pours out his wrath on evil, wicked, arrogant men that refuse to bow to him. So, like I said, I'm not going to discuss all the facets of the day of the Lord. One day we'll probably go through that, but I just want to look at a couple examples of how God's wrath is poured out in these end times. And probably the most obvious is that he pours out his wrath during what we call the Great Tribulation. So in Revelation 5, there's this scroll that has a seal on it that no one can open. Now, this is great because in ancient times, there was this title deed, kind of like we have today, for our homes. And what they would do is they would write the title on the inside, roll it up, put the kind of a summary of what it is on the outside so that when you're looking, you can sort and get it. And they would seal that thing with wax to seal it open. Seal it up. Well, in Revelation 5, we see a scroll here that is sealed with 7 seals, and it's written on the inside, it's written on the outside. The thing's a title deed, and no one is able to open it. Why is that? Because the only one that could break that seal was the one that owned the property. And they can't find the owner of the property. Well, all of a sudden, we see somebody show up. We have Jesus who has bought the property, the earth, with his blood, thus qualifying him to open the seals. And these seals are judgments on the earth. Like, man, if every time I opened up my envelope with a title in it, and an earthquake happened, I don't think I'd be opening that up. But he pops all 7 seals because he has the ability to do so. The first seal in Revelation 6:1 and 2 is the Antichrist. He rides on a white horse. He comes under a pretense of peace. It says in Daniel 9:27, he's got a crown. He's got royalty, power, authority. He's holding a bow. And I find it interesting, I've heard others point out before that he doesn't have any arrows with that bow. So like Daniel says, he comes in with this pretense of peace, but his goal is conquest. And oh, he will. He pops the second seal in 3 and 4, and warfare goes throughout the earth. There's war on earth. In 5 and 6, the third seal, famine across the earth. The fourth seal in 7 and 8 is death. 1/4 of the population of the world dies. He does the 5th seal, and it reveals those that have been martyred under the rule of the Antichrist. And they cry out for vengeance. Lord, how long? Even with what has happened here, what we call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse have hit the earth. Earth is ravaged. 25% of all people on the earth are dead. People are being beheaded because they are being saved during this time. And the martyrs are crying out to God saying, even with all this that has happened, it's not enough. Where is our vengeance? Are they sinning to ask that the just be punished? Well, was David? God never got on to David for saying, destroy my enemies. So my question is, how evil are men during this period of history? Because right now God commands us to love our enemies. But when the Israelites were going into Canaan, God said, destroy every one of them. And I won't name everything that they were doing in Canaan, the practices they were doing at that time, but it put Sodom to shame, the things they were doing, that they deserve the judgment. And at this point in time in history, they are deserving it. How hard are the hearts of these unbelievers that are killing the saints during the tribulation? That the martyrs are saying it's not enough. The sixth seal, in 12 through 14, Jesus breaks it, and there's astronomical and geographical upheaval. It says the sky rolls up like a scroll. I don't know what that looks like, but that's going to be awesome. I can't wait to see that. That sounds terrible of me. I'll edit that out of the video. It gets so bad that men beg for death. Let mountains fall on us, just to get away from the wrath of God, this eschatological wrath. Earth becomes such hell to them that they would rather hasten their trip there than to be on earth. You know, hell has to be better than what this is. I would rather go there. And then the seventh seal happens in 8:1. And the seventh seal is hardcore. It says that heaven sits quiet for half an hour. Because why? Because now that scroll is opened, the trumpet judgments are about to happen. And you think things have been rough now, things get real rough. Especially, it starts getting weird. The angel takes the key to hell, to the pit, opens it up, and weird demon locust things come out. Man, it gets wild. Which goes to show me that God's answering the prayers of the martyrs. So there's a lot more that could be said about God's end-time judgment. We're not going to go through the trumpets. We're not going to go through any of that. This is just a small snippet, but it proves that God's eschatological wrath is fierce and it's hard. Next, we have cataclysmic wrath. This speaks of a wrath that deals with massive natural or supernatural instances. If you worked for an insurance company, you would call this an act of God. There's two great examples of this in the Bible. The first is the Great Flood in Genesis 7. Genesis 6 starts to speak of the evils that men have begun to do. Like in verse number 2, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and they took wives for themselves, whoever they chose. Seems to me this is fallen angels that are procreating with men. Wild stuff. And then it talks about these mighty men of renown and Nephilim. And honestly, there's a lot of debate on there. I'm not even sure where I stand on this. It's debated if Nephilim were the children of the demon human offspring, or if they were Seth's descendants that married with Cain's unbelieving descendants, or it could have just been that these men of renown were mighty warrior kings who built themselves up these tribal empires, and they were kind of worshipped as gods themselves, like Xerxes of the Persian Empire. It's really hard to know for sure. The word is kind of a one-for-one translation, Nephilim. I believe the King James has giants for that, and giants could mean just huge dudes. Like we were talking about Vodi Balcom yesterday, and Caleb was telling us he met him, and I was like, well, he looks like a big guy. How is he? He's like, oh, he's massive. He's a giant. If you talk about my kids and me every now and then, have a guilty pleasure. It's professional wrestling. We'll watch it. Those dudes are huge. They're giants. John Cena's massive, just carved straight from granite. It could be that, or it could mean giants among men of renown. That is to say, when you call someone a giant among men, it's not speaking of their stature, but of their accomplishments. Napoleon was an average-sized dude, but he was a giant among men. So I don't know. I don't know what that is, but there we have. We have these. Either way, whatever that means, crazy sin was happening, and men were making themselves out to be gods. Men were trusting in themselves, not God. So God sends a flood in chapter 7 to wipe the earth clean of the sin that had already become rampant, which goes to show me, people will say, how do you know the Bible is real? And one of my defenses is I'll say 7 chapters into the book, about that far into the book, we already biffed it, and God had to wipe us out. How mankind of us is that we get our hands on it and it doesn't even take us. We can't even make it to chapter 10 before we can't even make it halfway through the book before we ruin it. So there we did. So men become so evil so quickly that judgment comes fast, and it comes cataclysmically. God uses natural means here, in this case a flood, to mostly destroy humanity. Of course, we talk about Noah, who was saved. A second example of this destruction would be Sodom in Genesis 19. The Lord set out to destroy Sodom because of their wickedness. Abraham, we know the story, begs him not to, and he talks God down to 10 people. There's not even 10 people that are righteous in that city, which honestly doesn't say a lot for Lot. Because think about it. Lot, his wife, his 2 daughters, his 2 son-in-laws, there's 6. There's 6 people. He only needed 4 more. The fact is that Lot's not a super young man at this time. He probably has more family than that. Lot probably has grandkids at this point. And it shows that Lot did not evangelize to his family. Lot failed in that regard. And then second of all, looking at Sodom, I was trying to find the population, and it's all over the place. But a city-state in ancient Greece would typically have around 10,000 residents. So I think it's safe to assume that Sodom would have at least had 5,000, if not more. I mean, it's an early city. It could be even more according. So the fact of this is that there's 5,000 people at least in this city, and they can't find 10 righteous. That means Lot didn't evangelize to his city. He didn't bother with his family. He didn't bother with his city. But Lot is called righteous Lot in the New Testament. He's a failure in every way, but God still looks upon him favorably, so he is spared the wrath that reigns on Sodom. That doesn't mean, Terry, to model your life on Lot. In verse 24, brimstone and fire rained down from heaven into Sodom. So here, instead of using a natural phenomenon cataclysmically, God uses a divine miracle, sending fire and sulfur, that's brimstone, down from heaven to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. So he could have used something natural. He could have caused an earthquake and made it fall into the earth. God could have, caused a tornado to come through and kill it. Any of these things that insurance would cover, but God makes sure to use something that insurance doesn't cover, and that's divine fire from heaven. Next, we have consequential wrath. Consequential wrath. So this is a wrath that speaks of consequences to man's actions. And this is best defined in Genesis 6, 7 through 9. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, this will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we will reap if we do not grow weary. Whatever a man sows, he reaps. And the fact is that this is obvious even for unbelievers. If you put a watermelon seed into the ground, what's going to pop up? Well, if I put it in the ground, nothing's going to pop up. But if a farmer does that, a watermelon. We grew watermelons a couple of years ago, and the deer enjoyed every one of them. So they ate our peppers too. Man, those deer. I like to look at deer, but I see why people hunt them now. They deserve it. So if you plant a seed, it's going to grow its proper fruit or its proper vegetable. If you behave in a certain way, you're going to get certain results. If you study for a test, you're going to have a better chance of passing the test. If you don't study for the test, you're liable to fail. This goes in the natural world. Let's look at some negatives on that. If you get caught speeding, chances are you get a ticket. It's spring, so if you mow your grass, chances are you get a sinus infection. And you hold it for 6 months. If you engage in sexual activity, chances are you get pregnant. If you experiment with drugs, chances are you get addicted. If you're friends with a bad crowd, you're not going to redeem them. They're going to corrupt your morals. If you're in a bad mood, you tend to put those that are around you in a bad mood. Get it together, Terry. This is just the law of cause and effect. It's obvious even to the natural world. It doesn't take us a Bible verse to understand this, that your actions have consequences. That's why this is called consequential wrath. Well, it goes a step farther here in Galatians and says, if you sow to your flesh, then of your flesh you reap corruption. If you're concerned only with your well-being and the well-being of your body, you will not benefit from it at all, because selfish gain has no eternal reward. I wish we could convince that to advertisers that constantly have you look at the self. This is for you. This is for you. You deserve this. Treat yourself. Selfish gain will only have you reap the crop of loneliness. How many people who are only in it for themselves have real friends? They don't, because you have to be a friend to have a friend. And if you can't be a friend, your friends are superficial. Selfish gain will only pay you the wages of sin. And ultimately, sin pays the wage of death. That's contrary to the spiritual seed in this passage, because the spiritual seed reaps eternal life. If you're sown a spiritual seed, you raise up and it's eternal. God reveals His wrath again using the natural order of things. It can be summed up like this. If you sin, you face God's wrath by experiencing the consequences of those sins here on earth. Lastly, and we'll be done, the wrath of abandonment. This is the scariest one. This is the wrath where God turns men over to their own devices. And I was going to read it, but I won't read it. Y'all are familiar with the passage, Romans 1, 18 through 32. The unbelieving people rebel so strongly against God that God finally says, okay, you don't want me. I'll go. Notice that in there, he gives them, if we were to read it, he gives them over to three things. In verse 24, he gives them over to the lusts of their hearts, to impurity. It results in their bodies being dishonored, rampant, unhinged sexuality. Then in 26, he gives them over to degrading passions. And they define this as women and men both exchanging the natural function. That's rampant, unhinged homosexuality. And then in verse 28, he finally gives them over to a depraved mind, to do things which are not proper. That's just rampant, unhinged, unrighteous unrighteousness. And in 29 through 31, it lists it: envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, gossips, slanderers, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, unmerciful, untrustworthy, unloving. And in verse number 32, it shows that they don't only practice them, but they give hearty approval to those that practice. This sounds like today. It sounds like today. It sounds almost as if God has said, the Western world, you don't want me, that's fine. Have yourself. And we have hit each of those three. We've already had a sexual revolution. We are on the tail end of a homosexual revolution. And now we're finding people that you can't even trust. This wrath is so terrifying because it shows that there will come a point where you reject God so long He eventually gives you what you want. If society screams for divine freedom, God may just grant it, and then you see society begin to break down. Fortunately, God chastises those that are His own. We're not free to behave that way. So, in conclusion, the number one argument I hear against this is, how in the world could God be so mean? My God would never behave this way. That's true. He wouldn't. Your God's not real. The real God, the true God, Jehovah, He is more than one dimension. He is love, but He's also wrath, and He's also justice. So there's two choices here. You can agree with Him and repent and worship Him, or you can disagree with Him and face His wrath. I would much rather take the former.